Good morning, church. Today we are going to talk about Jonah, a familiar story to most of us. But today we're going way beyond being swallowed up by a fish to look at what it means to have a calling from God that we're uncomfortable with. What happens when our dreams and God's calling don't line up? Jonah 1:1 says, "One day long ago, God's word came to Jonah, Amitai's son." Amittai, Jonah's dad, is also mentioned in 2 Kings, where it tells us that his hometown is Gitta-Heifer. That's right, Gitta-Heifer. Gitta-Heifer is right in the middle of Israel, both north-south and east-west, up on a mountain. If someone from Gitta-Heifer were going to Nineveh, which is in Iraq, they would be heading straight east, down a mountain and across a desert. There would be no need for a boat. In fact, the only place for getting on a ship the size mentioned in this story would be down the other side of the mountain, straight west to the port of Joppa on the Mediterranean Sea. God says, "Up on your feet and on your way to the big city of Nineveh. Preach to them. They're in a bad way, and I can't ignore it any longer." Nineveh was the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire that had conquered most of the known world. It was literally the big city. Jonah, a Jewish man from the little country of Israel, from the little wine production town of Gitta-Heifer, was sent by the God of the cosmos to the Assyrian capital to tell them that God had a better plan for them than the bad ways they had gotten themselves into. There was almost nothing held in common between Assyrians and Hebrews. And even less so between Assyrians from Nineveh and Hebrews from Gitta-Heifer. They spoke different, looked different, worshiped different. And in the eyes of the Hebrews, the Assyrians were detestable. But they were also highly influential and more than a little intimidating. In verse 3 it says, "But Jonah got up and went in the other direction to Tarshish, running away from God. He went down to the port of Joppa and found a ship headed for Tarshish. He paid the fare and went on board, and joining those going to Tarshish, as far away from God as he could get." So at this point, had Jonah been called by God? Yeah, right? He had an individual calling and a purpose. That individual calling was, of course, in line with the calling that God had given all of Israel through Abraham. That through his people, God would bless the entire world. But was Jonah living into his calling? No. God told him to take a land journey to the east, and he boarded a boat to the west. No one in Jonah's circles of friends would have blamed him. But doing what everyone expects of you is not the same as following God's call for your life. As we are followers of Jesus, we have a calling. Our calling is to show the world that God's amazing grace, what it looks like and what it sounds like in action. When it comes to our individual calling, we don't get to pick who we show God's love toward. We have the parable of the Good Samaritan that tells us that everyone is our neighbor and that anyone in need is who we are called to help. Jesus said to love your enemies, and on the cross he showed us just how far that love goes. Whatever you find yourself doing for a job or for fun, really just wherever you find yourself, it is your purpose to reflect the love of God into the world by both word and deed. We are not here to judge who deserves love, who deserves healing, or who deserves our time. We are here to love all of those that God puts in our path. It's plainly spelled out in Matthew 5. You are to be the salt that brings out the God flavors in the world, and the light that reflects the God color into the world. As a church, our calling is the same. Jesus said to go out into our world teaching, healing, and loving. But when there is a global pandemic, civil unrest, and political tensions that make it uncomfortable to even leave our homes, it can be tempting to sulk, to hide behind our keyboards and protect what's left of our American dreams. Remember the good old days when we could just invite people to come to our church? Remember the good old days when common decency and civility ruled? Remember when it was so much better than it is now? Let's go back there. Let's go back to where it's comfortable. But here's the problem with that. God isn't back there. God is always right here and right now. Jonah was told by God to go to the people in Nineveh. God had a desire to welcome them. He would save them. Jonah didn't want to do that. Jonah didn't like those people. They dressed weird and worshipped weird and had a different form of government. And by all indications, as the capital of the Assyrian Empire, their culture was winning. Jonah wanted to hold on to what Israel already had. So Jonah got on a boat and he went the exact opposite direction of Nineveh so that he could hide from God. You see, glorifying the past and saying how good it would be if everything was like it used to be is just trying to hide from God in the past. God has a purpose for us here and now, right in our current reality, no matter how we feel about it. So what happened to Jonah when he tried to run from God? The same thing that happens to all of us from Adam and Eve on. Life got harder. He got thrown overboard and nearly drowned. With the benefit of hindsight, we know it was a blessing, but in that moment, when you're sinking and the boat that you were on is sailing towards the horizon, when your church is closed and masks are uncomfortable and everyone is discussing racism and you feel like it's not your problem, but everyone wants to make it your problem, it doesn't feel like a blessing. To save Jonah from drowning, God sent a fish to swallow him up. We all know that fish smell, right? Or have you ever had to put your hand in to pull a hook out when the fish swallows it? Or have you ever seen or filleted a fish? All of that stuff that you pull out that is way too gross to eat. That's what Jonah would have been living in and day out. It's not death, but there is nothing that feels good about where Jonah finds himself. That kind of struggle changes a person, a church. Maybe that's the point. When he finally gets out of the fish, it is by being regurgitated onto the shore of the last place on earth he wanted to be, the place where God had sent him. Have you ever felt like this? Like you knew exactly what you wanted out of life and exactly where you wanted to go. And suddenly it was like God had you thrown out of the very boat that was supposed to transport you to your dreams. Then it just keeps getting worse. And the mucus and slime of life was just all over you. And when you thought that you had finally reached the bottom, you prayed to be rescued. And God's reply was just to have you thrown up on the shore of the place you didn't want to be and people you didn't want to be around. So what are Jonah's options here? He was just disgustingly, but miraculously saved by God. He could continue his obstinance and die, maybe yelling a few insults at the people he was meant to love on the way down. He could do what he was called to do, but hate every second of it. Not really embracing or loving those who are different, but not leaving them without a word from God either. Or he could embrace his calling, reach out in love to understand, respect, and share a blessing with those he used to despise, and both cultures would be better for the effort. I wish people chose the last option. But Jonah does the most likely human thing and takes the middle road, avoiding both the conflict and the blessing. He begrudgingly does what God tells him, but he's still mad, hurt, confused, and smelly. He uses his mouth to say the right words, but never lets people into his heart. He finishes his task and just sits around feeling sorry for himself outside of Nineveh. The parallels to the prodigal son story can hardly be missed. Can you imagine the party that must have been happening in Nineveh? They were headed for destruction. They turned to God and were saved. One of the most beautiful cities on earth is celebrating the goodness of God. And what is the prophet of God doing? Is he joining in the celebration, singing and dancing? No. He's sitting outside sulking like the older brother because he didn't think it was right. It wasn't his will being obeyed. It wasn't his people being blessed. We read in chapter 4, Jonah was furious. He lost his temper. He yelled at God, "God, I knew it. When I was back home, I knew this was going to happen. That's why I ran off to Tarshish. I knew you were sheer grace and mercy, not easily angered, rich in love, and ready at the drop of a hat to turn your plans of punishment into a program of forgiveness. So God, if you won't kill them, kill me. I'm better off dead." Jonah did not want to fulfill Israel's call to bless all of the nations. He wanted his little club, the Hebrews, to be blessed while everyone else burned for turning their backs on God. Jonah is not the hero of this story. Jonah is a warning. So God said, "What do you have to be angry about?" But Jonah just left. He went out of the city to the east and sat down in a sulk. The callback here is to Genesis when Adam and Eve are sent out east of Eden to be exiled. Jonah is attempting to exile himself from God's plan for the redemption of those that he doesn't approve of. He is east of the place God told him to be. He's done the work God called him to do. He's sitting under a plant that miraculously appeared just to give him shade. And he's choosing to be miserable. Then the shade plant dies. Jonah makes it clear that he would rather die than continue on with this life. God is over in Nineveh, throwing a party for the children who had wandered off, nearly died, but now returned. God's prophet is sulking. He seems to be saying, "God, I went where you told me to go. I did what you told me to do. And what do I get in return? I get to die alone, smelly, and without so much as some shade in the desert." Right now it's easy to feel like America is Nineveh. And I think that's even the right way to read this story. A sense of hopelessness is setting in for many. And even if it isn't hopeless, if saving America means that all of those people, whoever those people are, if they get off the hook scot-free, then we're not interested. Why can't it be like what we remember? Why can't it be the place we were comfortable in? If you live in America, then this is the place God has called you to share his good news. And his good news is good news to all people, not just our people, regardless of how we feel about that. We need to fulfill our calling to love people, even when we have to wear masks and can't sing. Even if we think the fact that we have to wear masks and can't sing is ridiculous. We need to fulfill our calling to love when we can't get hugs or even sit in our pew. Even when we think it's ridiculous that we can't get hugs or sit in our pew. Right now, the call to love our neighbor means trying to understand people who look, talk, and understand the world differently than you do. It means we have to read books, listen to opposing views, and have hard conversations. We aren't called to love only those who conform to our way. The calling of Jonah is to leave our nice little community and love those who have clearly turned their backs on all that we hold sacred. We have to go out of our way to bandage their wounds, pay with our resources for them to be healed, learn about what is causing their wounds in the first place. In short, we have to actually love them. Does God call us to share the good news of his grace to all people? Is that our calling? Yeah. And is God surprised by the fact that COVID has our church building closed? No. Since it's Independence Day, I'll throw this one in. Was God surprised on July 4th, 1776, that the Declaration of Independence was signed? No. That document says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Americans that have had their right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness oppressed are rising up and saying enough is enough. Is God surprised by that? No. Some people out there are exploiting these circumstances and using them for their own gain. Has God been caught off guard by their evil? No. So if the state of our nation and the state of our church is not a surprise to God, then can we also say with confidence that God must have a plan for his church in the midst of these exact circumstances? But here's the catch that got Jonah. Your life isn't about you. You don't get to set your purpose. Your life is a gift given to you by a good God. And so receive it with joy. Experience it with passion and purpose. If there is hurting people in this community, then we are called to bring healing. If there are hurting people in your Facebook feed, you are called to bring peace. Wherever suffering is happening, God is calling his church to be his hands and feet. And in America right now, suffering is not hard to come by. We have to be willing to learn about, share with, and love those different than us. God's plan for his church is way bigger than the American dream. And if the American dream is getting in the way of God's good purpose, then we have to pick a side. We can sulk on the shore east of a dream, or we can embrace a very real calling to humbly walk with the hurting, to listen to the oppressed, and to work towards justice for all people, believing that we are all created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The people of Nineveh received the message Jonah gave and were saved. Jonah could have been in the center of a worship service the size of a city that takes 3 days to walk across. This could have been the greatest moment of his life. He was thrown overboard, swallowed up, spit out, and still the word of God brought revival. But Jonah goes and sulks east of the city. Jonah received a clear calling from God. He was able to fulfill that calling, and all of history remembers his name. But I get the sense from the abrupt ending of this story that he died a sad, depressed person who couldn't let go of his own preferences in order to celebrate what God was doing right then and there. God has called us to be the hands and feet of Jesus in this city, right here and right now, in the midst of uncomfortable conversations and circumstances around issues of race. Right here in the midst of a pandemic. I know we liked how things were. We liked the choir and being in our comfy pew and getting messages in our little mailboxes. But that isn't what is happening right now. That isn't the Nineveh, the America that God has called us to. We are out here. We're outside of our church. Literally outside of our comfort zone. Not because God made a mistake, but because sometimes it takes being thrown overboard and swallowed whole to get to where God needs us to be. And where God needs us to be is out here, out there. I can tell you from experience, it only takes 2.5 hours to walk across this city. And there are like 200 of us between the outdoor service and the online service. We've got to find new ways of doing what God has called us to do in our current reality. God is going to fulfill his purposes. We can get on board and sail the winds of changing times towards our destiny. Or we can get thrown up on a beach and pout alone in the desert about how unfair it is that everything is changing. So today, find some time to get alone and quiet before God. Ask God what it is he would have you do. When it comes to understanding culture, there are books to read, conversations to be had, and structures to reform. When it comes to COVID, there are lonely people to call, prayers for healing to be offered, and new ways of discipling to be found. I don't know what all this means for you, but God does. Ask Him. I don't know what this is going to mean for our church, but God does, so let's ask Him. Decide today to let go of your plans, your preferences, and your past, and be part of the new thing that God is doing in and amongst us right here and right now.